Hey everybody, it's Eric Papenfuse coming from the back rooms of Midtown Scholar. It is Buy Day Friday, and we're going to show you each week 3 books that came into our store through book buying that we think you'll find interesting. One of the ways we buy books is we do house calls. We did a house call in State College, Pennsylvania this week at the home of an architect. And look what we found. And if you're watching The Gilded Age on PBS, you'll know all about Stanford White. But we found the complete works of Stanford White and his firm, McKim White, which was published in the early 20th century. It's got these great ties on it. And if you open it up, it has all of the designs that McKim, Mead, and White produced, including many in New York City that have been featured. For instance, here's the library of the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York. So if you're watching The Gilded Age, you may enjoy the complete works of McKim, Mead, and White. We also buy books from other booksellers. It's a real source. And a bookseller in central Pennsylvania brought in this Bible this week. And normally Bibles are pretty common and not that valuable, but it's an interesting Bible because of who owned it. It was owned by the great 19th century actor, Edwin Forrest. And he's famous because he established a home for retired actors in Philadelphia that eventually became the Actors Fund. And this was all done in the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination by noted actor John Wilkes Booth. So actors fell out of fashion, and he looked out for them. And if you look inside the book, you can see the book plate from the Edwin Forrest home in Philadelphia. So books are sometimes particularly interested because who owned them and where they came from. Finally, we're going to end each week with one book that came in through book buying that we find humorous. And by far, the most humorous book of the week was The Making of a Ninja. And it's particularly interesting because of the wonderful illustrations. If you open it up, you can see this gentleman here teaching you how to submerge yourself while carrying boxes in a lake. A useful skill. Well, thanks for watching. Each Friday, we're going to have Buy Day Friday right here at noon. So check us out next week with 3 new books that have come in through book buying at Midtown Scholar. Oh, hello. Hi, I didn't see you there. I'm practicing my ninja box moving from last week. It's Eric Papenfuse. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. And we're going to show you 3 new arrivals that have come into our sort room just this past week. We went to a house call in Pennsylvania this week and got some really interesting books, which at first glance may seem to be incomplete, why they're missing pages. And on the back, you can see examples of the spines of the book. And that's because these are salesman samples. They would have little bits of examples and then an order form in the back of the book. And from the Civil War to World War I, booksellers went door to door selling them. I find this one particularly interesting because in the back, there's an appeal to soldiers to go door to door when you're home from the front. And you too can make money like Ira Schwanger in Pennsylvania, who in just 34 days sold 144 cloth copies of this book and upsold 38 in the Morocco binding. So salesman samples, something to look out for, something that's very collectible today. It's Good Friday, and I also wanted to share with you a true scholarly book that I found fascinating. This came from a library sale in Chester, Pennsylvania this past week, and it's a history of the stamps that were made on bread loaves from the early Egyptian times all the way through the Greco-Roman Empire and into the Byzantine Empire. It's very interesting. It has pictures of every existing bread stamp, including petrified bread from Pompeii. And the author argues that you can tell a lot about the spread of Christianity by the way the images on bread changed from, say, harvest symbols to Christian symbols over time. A very specific book and a really interesting monograph, the type of book we like to have here at Midtown Scholar. Finally, a funny book. And this book I was so happy to find at a library sale. I had already heard about this book. It lives on in legend and lore. It is How to Avoid Huge Ships. Something which may seem axiomatic, but the author invites you to imagine yourself out on the water in a rowboat when suddenly on the horizon you see a picture like this approaching you, and it tells you what you need to do to avoid them. We'll be back next week with 3 new arrivals live from Connecticut in our book barn. I'll see you next Friday and every Friday on Book Buy Friday. Hey everybody, it's Eric Papenfuse. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day, and we're coming to you live from Northford, Connecticut from the book barn. Come on in and see what we've been doing. For the last several days, we've been boxing up tens of thousands of books, all of which are coming to Harrisburg and the Midtown Scholar. We've boxed so many books, it was hard to find just 3 for today's episode, but we did it. And I want to show you the best and most exciting finds. First off, here's a rather nondescript book, but if you open it up, you'll see inside it's got a copy of Charles Dickens's American Notes from 1842. It's published along with 4 or 5 other pirated editions because when Dickens came to America in 1842, one of the things he complained about was American copyright law, or the lack thereof. American publishers would just pirate his books and he would get no royalties whatsoever. This was actually published by Harper in 1842. And within 24 hours of the book arriving by boat in New York Harbor, 3 different editions had already been published of American Notes. In American Notes, Dickens was not kind to Harrisburg. Let me read you what he wrote. He wrote, "At length, however, we emerged upon the streets of Harrisburg, whose feeble lights reflected dismally from the wet ground and did not shine out upon a very cheerful city." Thanks, Charles. Well, we found that book. Then, up in the rafters at the highest point, way up there, we found an amazing book, Chaucer's Collected Works. And not only is it a beautiful English edition with a wonderful frontispiece of Chaucer, here you can see it here, but it was the first edition of Chaucer to be published in Roman type as opposed to Gothic type, which made the book even more accessible. And did you know Chaucer, as the greatest English writer before Shakespeare, was famous for being the first person to use thousands of English words, including the word box. And where would we be without Chaucer coining that word? Finally, a funny book, Water Babies. It's not just about giving birth, it's a lifestyle for your baby. The book seriously argues that rather than dogs or cats, toddlers should be trained as fish with their best friends. And on top of that, if you put a toddler in the water early enough, their eyesight improves. And they can even learn to read underwater. We'll see you next Friday for 3 more books on Buy Day Friday. Hello everybody, it's Friday, so it must be a buy day, and we are coming to you live from the Midtown Scholar tent sale, right here in the heart of Midtown Harrisburg. Come on in and let me show you what we have. Inside the tent, we have 15,000 books, all priced $3 and under. So you can come, do your own treasure hunt, and find your own remarkable finds. I was at a book sale yesterday in Annville, Pennsylvania. I had 3 dealers come up to me and say they found amazing things here at the tent sale. So we're open through Sunday. Come check it out. But Connecticut is the gift that keeps giving, and I wanted to show you 3 new finds for Buy Day Friday that came straight from Connecticut. Now, the first book is a really interesting book because it is a homemade binding, and it was bound in 1826 by a gentleman named John Pepperday. How do I know that? Well, I know that because he's bound his name into the book. And it is a collection of colloquies by Erasmus, which was a really interesting way to learn Latin in the old days. John, however, didn't like it very much. And as a result, he was forced by his teacher to write, "Avoid punishment, avoid punishment, avoid punishment, avoid punishment." And then he dated it down here in 1826. And to make matters worse, his teacher told him to take that, paste it to the boards of this Erasmus book, and then rebind the book so he would always remember to study his Latin. So there's an example of a homemade binding. The second book is actually a pair of books, and these are widely considered the most famous poem in the English language, Paradise Lost. And speaking of bindings, look at the binding label on this one. This is an 18th century binding label before they had to be perfect, and it shows the character of the binder. But Paradise Lost, of course, by Milton, is a fascinating work, and this is interesting because it is extra illustrated, which means the person who bound this book took illustrations from future Milton books and tipped them in. These were not original illustrations published in the book. He also was sort of annoyed that this edition from 1720s didn't include a life of Milton, so he wrote one himself. and he put that in the back of the book in manuscript. And if you like Milton, you might like the illustrated versions that came out later in the Victorian period. My favorite is this by Gustave Doré, the French illustrator, which is one of the great romantic illustrated books. Here's a example of Doré's work. This is the devil descending to earth. If you've watched the TV show Lucifer, you might see how inspired it clearly was by Doré and by Paradise Lost. Now, I would call these illustrations stunning and terrific, and so would Milton, because he invented the use of those two words in Paradise Lost. All right, we're going to finish with a funny one. Now, you know that we're a scholarly bookstore. We love scholarly books, and I have the ultimate scholarly book. This is a book that was published in both Dutch and English. It is a study of testosterone in rats, and it is hundreds of pages filled with the smallest and most important graphs, teaching you everything you could possibly want to know about rat testosterone. But I want you to imagine yourself again, this time being this researcher in Holland. You finished your magnum opus, you send it to the publisher, and the publisher says, okay, yes, you can write half of it in Dutch and half of it in English, but what it really needs is some killer cover art. You say, okay, we'll go with killer cover art, and then it comes back from the printer with perhaps the most ridiculous illustration ever on a scholarly work. There you go, our bespeckled rat studying the human. I challenge anyone to find a more ridiculous cover to a scholarly work. All right, we'll be back next week and every week on Fridays for 3 new finds. Come and check out the tent sale. Until next week, I'm Eric Papenfuse saying so long. Hello everybody, it's Eric Papenfuse, and it's Friday, so it must be a buy day, and we are back at the Midtown Scholar sort room in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to talk today about Victorian cloth bindings. An article came out this past week. It made its way on social media from National Geographic about the Poison Book Project. And there was a lot of talk about these conservators at Winterthur who had cataloged books that used poisonous dyes in the Victorian period. And I, of course, took this as a challenge, and to the 3 book sales I went to this past week in Pennsylvania, I determined I could find as many poisonous books as possible. And when you know how many I found over a dozen. And the most toxic, most poisonous color used during the Victorian period was emerald green. And emerald green was made with arsenic. So if you see this bright Victorian green, especially in the mid-19th century, it could kill you if ingested. And I'm waiting for that Victorian murder mystery novel where the one spouse kills the other spouse by taking a little corner of the book, putting it in their tea, and then putting the book back on the shelf for the hapless inspector to peruse while searching for clues. Arsenic in old books. Another color that was popular during the Victorian period that is equally toxic is, in fact, chrome yellow. This was actually more common, and it was used later in the 1880s and the 1890s. Chrome yellow contains lead, and it also contains other carcinogens. Now, these books are perfectly safe to handle. Just make sure you wash your hands. You can keep them in plastic if you need to, but you don't want to eat them. If that's too creepy a topic to collect, then I recommend you spend some time collecting Victorian cloth bindings because of the designers. And there were several interesting designers in the late 19th century that were women, one of whom was Margaret Armstrong. And let me show you a close-up of the bottom of this binding. Can you see that? Margaret Armstrong always put her monogram on her jacket covers, M.A. And if you look closely, you can find these beautiful Art Nouveau influenced turn-of-the-century bindings designed by her. Another person who worked alongside her was Sarah Whitman. Sarah Whitman designed these covers for the Sarah Orne Jewett books, but a little sparser than the others, but also heavily Art Nouveau. And there are many female book designers. You can find their books today for $50 or less, including some lesser-known people. This one was designed by Amy Richards. You'll notice I have this in a plastic bag. And I have it in a plastic bag because you know what happens when you mix chrome yellow and Prussian blue? Well, you get olive green. And that would be another poisonous book. So I think the best advice is in the immortal words of Kevin Kline in A Fish Called Wanda, avoid the green books. They're not ripe yet. Finally, a funny book. We have outwitting squirrels. Spring has sprung. If you're like my father, you're filling up the bird feeder, you're waiting for those birds, and you are trying 101 cunning stratagems to render these squirrels unable to get your bird seed. However, one of the nice things about outwitting squirrels is despite Crisco, despite water pistols, despite all these strategies, you can't actually outwit a squirrel, and you end up with picture after picture of these squirrels, fat squirrels, happily having destroyed the bird feeders and gotten to the seeds. Outwitting squirrels. All right, we'll see you next week on Buy Day Friday. Hello, everybody. It's Eric Papenfuse. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. And today I want to talk a little bit about sourcing books at auctions. Auctions are a wonderful way to acquire books. We bid at auctions all the time. There's a great website called Rare Book Hub. You can check it out. It has a daily, weekly, and monthly book auction calendar. And when I'm buying books at auction, I try and buy books that interest me, because then I can explain to others why they should be interested in them as well. But I'm also looking for two characteristics. One is scarcity, or the uniqueness of an item, and the second has to do with aesthetic beauty. And in the category of aesthetic beauty, I wanted to talk today a little bit about Victorian gift books. And just last week, I was fortunate to buy 2 lots of gift books. Bought about 24 of these books at auction. And you can see these still have the auction tags from the particular auction I was in. And what is a gift book? Well, a gift book was very popular from about the 1820s to the Civil War. They were annuals, and they contained these wonderfully elaborate, often embossed leather covers, gilt gold work on the spine and on the front boards, and they were very expensive books at the time, and they're lovely works of art. In fact, at the time they cost $4 or $5, which is about 4 or 5 times what a regular book might cost. So a cloth book was maybe 75 cents or $1, and these were more. So the equivalent of like buying a $100 book today. And they became done every year, and you would buy them in the fall as a Christmas present or a holiday or New Year's present for either your sweetheart or somebody that you care very much about. A lot of them are very sentimental. They have names after flowers like the rose or the bouquet or gemstones. But these are just called the Gift of Friendship and Memory's Gift. Because the embossed covers required the leather to be really thin, oftentimes it's split. And here's an interesting fact about gift books. They were the first books in American history to have dust jackets as well as slip cases, and that was to protect the elaborate bindings. But they are also famous because of 2 things. One, they were some of the first books to use steel engravings. And this book is interesting here because it has a wonderful steel engraved portrait by the American artist Thomas Sully. And in some cases, the steel engravings are the only known copies of these portraits that are still able to be found. You can see the quality of that. They also paid the authors very well. And so somebody like Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote all of his stories for gift books. And when he published a book called Twice Told Tales, it was because they had been told first in the gift books of the era. This gift book is particularly interesting because it contains a short story, the first printing ever of a story by Poe called The Pit and the Pendulum. So don't ask why a story of torture in the Spanish Inquisition is in the midst of this sentimental Victorian book, or do ask, because at the beginning of the book it talks about how this is an American volume with American authors and American illustrators, and it's a really, really wonderful thing. Over 1,000 of these gift books were published in America between the 1820s and the Civil War, so they're fun to collect today. Second topic at auction has to do with scarcity. And I also found at this very same auction an amazing scrapbook, and that was a Victorian pastime. This happens to be a scrapbook which is just filled with news clippings related to President James Garfield. It starts at the beginning with his nomination. It runs through and has everything from broadsides and campaign literature to his speeches. It even has some of the things he said about the gold standard, and it contains the maxims of James Garfield. Did you know he was famous for saying, "I would rather be beaten in right than succeed in wrong"? Well, I had no idea. And if you thought politics was nasty today, Well, you didn't want to be a Democrat running against Garfield, because if you were associated with Boss Tweed, John Wilkes Booth, Yellow Fever Blackburn, Mrs. Surratt, and the Lincoln conspirators, John B. Floyd the Great Gun Thief, and Gully the Murderer. That would be if you were General Hancock. So tough politics of the day. And then the scrapbook, which contains a lot of unique things, like these very hard to find pamphlets, even the black-edged obituary columns from the newspaper clippings, ends with just a simple letter to the editor about the murderer Gateau, who was an office seeker who shot Garfield. And it ends in this letter, which just simply says, we hope you're dead, and your putrid breath has gone out over your rotten corpse, and millions will shout out that you are where the fire don't go out. So on that negative note, we are going to end with a funny book. And viewers of Instagram may know this book, and you may have seen it in the window already. It is How to Train Your Goldfish Using Dolphin Training Techniques. But I bet you've never opened up the book and seen some of those amazing techniques in action, teaching your goldfish to do it. Now, this book is funny in part because it contains some of the most hilarious Amazon reviews you will read online. This one I like because he talks about how he can't really review the book till after the criminal court case is over on the advice of his lawyers. But suffice it to say that there are certain skills that you can teach your goldfish that have adverse effects, such as attaching mines to ships. And all he's going to say is he has a 25-foot crater in his living room. So How to Train Your Goldfish Using Dolphin Training Techniques, our funny book of the day. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week and every week on Friday for Buy Day Friday. Hey everybody, it's Eric Papenfuse. You're watching on Friday, but we decided to record this week on Saturday because we're coming to you from the largest library sale on the East Coast, right here in State College, Pennsylvania, sponsored by the American Association of University Women. Had to get up at 4 a.m. this morning and drive here, and what an amazing sale it's been. We have found thousands of books. I thought I'd take the opportunity to talk about one type of book this week, which is the first printing or the first edition. When you're dealing with modern fiction, you want to look for the earliest version of a work, especially if you're dealing with sci-fi authors like Robert Jordan or William Gibson or maybe Stephen King. There are a number of different ways to determine if a book is a first edition. For this Angle of Repose by Wallace Stegner, which is a little bit of an older book, you can see it actually quite helpfully says first edition on it. But more recent books, like Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Committed, they have a number line in them. And in order to get the first printing, that number line needs to contain the number 1. And we just had him give an amazing talk last night at the Scholar. And I wish we'd had this book and we could have got him to sign the first printing. When you're dealing with an author like Stephen King, especially early Stephen King, there are an awful lot of book club versions of Stephen King. One way you can tell it's real and not book club, it doesn't have a number line, doesn't say first printing, but the cover's embossed. It's easy to touch. It has headbands, and it's generally a little bit fancier paper than the book club edition. And there's some other fine points, publishers call them points, which tell you if a book is a first edition. All these are first editions, including this interesting Lost World and the Margaret Atwood. If you look this way, you'll see that we bought a couple thousand books, and considering there were 200,000 books on the floor, I think we did really well. One of the things that we like to do when we're buying books is we like to find books that don't have barcodes, because a lot of folks that are at these sales have these electronic scanners, and they're zapping the books. But if the book doesn't have a barcode to be zapped on the back, they tend to pass it over. So here's a classic scholarly book that we found going on Amazon for like $150. It's like the definitive edited University Press, William Wordsworth, but a lot of scanners just passed it by because there was no barcode to scan. And sometimes you always have to look inside the books, because here's an example of a book that had a surprise. It's normally just an Anne Rice. It doesn't say anything. It's $2, but on the inside, there it was, signed by the author. And of course, we found other books. A lot of the types of books we have, we try and find specific books, illustrated books. This is a great book on Spanish shotguns. And we've had a wonderful time. We're going to take all these back, and they'll all be in the Scholar soon. Want to end on a funny book? We had a lot to choose from today. The hobby section did not disappoint. And today's funny book is Crafting with Cat Hair. Yes, it's a real thing. And according to the authors, one of the #1 things you can do with your leftover cat hair is you can create finger puppets, like the puppet on the cover of this book. Crafting with cat hair, soon to be available at the Midtown Scholar. Hey, thanks for watching. We'll be back live next week and every Friday at noon here on Buy Day Friday. Hey everybody, it's Friday, so it must be a buy day, and I wanted to take you to Lancaster to the historic Water Street Bindery. This building here has been a book bindery since at least the 1840s. And I want you to come on in and meet my friend Tony Haverstick, who is the proprietor, who does all the amazing restoration work here. We're gonna come all the way in, and this is Tony. He says hi.
Hi.
This building is particularly interesting because it's sort of in the original state that it was in the 19th century. And if you look here on the wall, you can see some examples of some of the books that were bound by the binder who lived here in the 19th century. And now we're going to come over and we're going to look at some of the books that Tony has just bound for me. When we go to a book binder, we often go because the books that we have are not in contemporary binding. So I want to start with a book that originally had a library binding. It looked a bit like this. It was a beautiful old book, but unfortunately, it didn't have any real appeal. This book was published in 1649, and it's a famous book because it was published after the beheading of Charles I by Parliament in the aftermath of the English Revolution. And it's particularly famous because of this frontispiece portrait of Charles praying. The book came out right after Charles was beheaded. It went through a number of different editions, and it was something of a collectible book if you love the king, and so it was actually dangerous to possess. And Tony has done a wonderful period binding for this in full leather, and that is an example of why we might come to have a book redone. Another thing which Tony has done has to do with a different Charles who was King of France 100 years earlier than our Charles I. This would be Charles IX. Charles IX was a boy king of France, and he became king of France in 1560. And this book was published, come on around, and you can see, in 1565. Now, Charles became king at the age of 10, and this is exactly the type of book that he would have owned. And what's interesting is it's both an Aldine, which is a book published by Aldus Manutius and his heirs, but it is also signed Charles the King in France, in French. So quite an amazing book. And Tony's put the boards back on. He's restored the hinges and the paper. It's 2 volumes, and now it's readable. And one of the things that was really interesting about this book was it had all of this, what's called binder's waste. And these pieces of vellum were basically used by the original binders of the book as strengthening for the joints. And I asked him to save these as he was restoring it because you can read some of these, and they may tie back to the royal ownership of Charles IX, which we're trying to prove. All right, we're going to end today on a funny book. It's not a laugh out loud funny book, but it is funny to me. And this is neat because Tony made a box for this book. By all other means, it sort of looks like a book on a shelf, but when you open it up, it's a surprise. It is actually a box of an early pamphlet. And this book is particularly funny because it is the first climate change denier work in American history. It was published in 1799 by Noah Webster, who's famous for his dictionary. But this book argues for the first time that global warming is, in fact, fake. That Thomas Jefferson is wrong, that all the scientists of the time are wrong. And he basically says we've got as much snowfall now as we've ever had, and don't worry about this deforestation. There's no such thing as global warming. And so obviously today, when people have this climate change debate and they want to deny global warming, they can go back to the #1 dissertation by Noah Webster on the subject of change in temperature from 1799. So a really fun book. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next Friday and every Friday at noon on Buy Day Friday. Hey everybody, it's Friday. I'm Eric Papenfuse. It must be a buy day, and we want to show you some amazing new things that have come into the sort room here at Midtown Scholar. Let's get right to it. This week, I want to give you a little bit of a sneak peek of some of the things that we're going to have at the new collectibles room we're opening this fall at the Midtown Scholar. And one of the things that we're going to have is pamphlets. And pamphlets were a very common way of communicating in the 19th and 18th century. Speeches, orations, sermons, you know it. Somebody like Daniel Webster, every time he had a speech, it was published in pamphlet form. These are all by Daniel Webster, and they'll be available for sale in the new room. But I wanted to show you one particular sermon that I found really interesting. And this is how we're going to present them in the collectible room in nice archival sleeves. Was a sermon by Timothy Dwight on dueling that came out right in the aftermath of the Hamilton-Burr duel. Now, Dwight was a conservative Federalist. He was also the president of Yale. And when he heard about the death of Alexander Hamilton, he decided to preach about the evils of dueling. He read into that account a sort of metaphor for the decline of the Federalist Party. And he blamed Hamilton because of the sin of dueling, which Hamilton had undertaken. And he said if the Federalists were ever going to come back into power and get rid of this Jefferson guy, we were going to need to have a moral cleansing, and that would mean no more dueling. And it's also interesting, I was reading it last night, he talks about the fact that dueling actually violates the marriage vow. And that, of course, made me think of Eliza. If you're fans of Hamilton, the musical, and who gets to tell the story, but really it was Eliza who Hamilton let down the most by getting himself killed by Aaron Burr. So a sermon on dueling. One last thing about this, it was so popular, he preached it in New Haven at Yale, but also in New York, and it was published in both places. So we have in the pamphlet room a New York copy and a Hartford, Connecticut copy. So pamphlet material, very common in the 19th century. When microfilming started to come in the 1970s and 1980s, a lot of institutions like the Library Company in Philadelphia decided to get rid of all their pamphlets. So they're pretty common on the marketplace today, and they are fun to collect. The other book I wanted to talk about today is perhaps the most exciting thing I have ever purchased at auction. So brace yourself. It is a copy of a book which lists the works of the famous American painter Thomas Sully. Now, if you know me at all, you know I'm a big fan of the artist Thomas Sully, and we have some of his work for sale in the collectibles room. In fact, if you look up here, that portrait there was by Thomas Sully and is available for sale. We also have some other portraits, including this of the woman up there, which were by Sully's son-in-law, the artist John Nagel. These were both Philadelphia painters. At any rate, when Sully died in 1871, things that were left in his studio were split up among the family. And one of the most exciting things that he had was a scrapbook in which he pasted little sketches and drawings that he made over the course of his career. And the family apparently fought over it, and all the really great sketches got sold at auction, including one of George Washington reviewing the troops. That sold for $1 million at Christie's and is the single highest price ever received for any type of Sully work, and it's just a sketch. Well, all the good ones got sold, but the ones that the family wasn't really sure about, they ended up holding on to, and they went to this gentleman named Jeffrey Sully, and he recently sold his copy of the inventory, which included some of the remaining things that were in the sketchbook. And I wanted to show you two. And these are really interesting because you can ask yourself, well, I can see why that didn't sell at auction. This is interesting because this is an ink blot print. And what Sully used to do is he would take ink, he would put it on a piece of glass, smear it up, plop it down on a blotter piece of paper, and then he would try and draw inspiration, almost like a Rorschach test for artists. And he saw in this apparently a cave and other landscape motifs, rocks and boulders, and then he used it as the basis for a future painting, a landscape, which he did mostly to amuse himself. He was known for his paintings. But so this is a blotter painting by Thomas Sully, and that came along with the book. Also came along with the book this wonderful sketch of a young boy or girl with a dog. And what's interesting about it, it shows you a little bit about Sully's technique. He started small, and then he went to a slightly larger square, and artists do this all the time from a sense of perspective. You see how this was attached to the back of a scrapbook Well, this is an original piece from his sketchbook. And what I like about this is that on the back of it, you can see that it has, in Sully's handwriting, a notation that it's Washington reviewing the troops. So on the back of this sketch was the $1 million George Washington one in the book, which they previously cut up and sold, and then they left this one as not being worthy. But isn't it charming? And just as one more surprise, Sully reused paper because paper was valuable, so that's why the scrapbook was based on an old ledger. But on the back of this, it's a letter that was actually written to him by the Philadelphia printer John Dunlap. And Dunlap is basically saying, hey, Sully, I have a Rembrandt. How much is it worth? Will you tell me how much it's worth? And Dunlap is most famous for printing the Declaration of Independence. And if you can find a copy of that in an old book, well, that is worth millions and millions of dollars today. A letter about his Rembrandt, which I didn't even know he had, well, that's worth a lot less. But what a charming, amazing thing, and an amazing personal collection that came in at auction. All right, we're gonna end today on a funny note. And this book really takes the cake. Here we go. It's called Cluck, the Story of Chickens in the Cinema. And yes, it is a comprehensive history of every time a chicken has appeared in a Hollywood movie. And it starts back with the original Silence of Charlie Chaplin. There's Charlie Chaplin and a chicken uniform. Goes through all of the great movies of the 20th century, including Rocky. There's Rocky with chickens, and it details every single appearance of a chicken on film in Hollywood. It also alleges a lot of foul play in Hollywood. Well, that's another issue of Buy Day Friday for you. I look forward to seeing you next Friday, and we're going to take you on a tour of that new collectibles room. See you then. Hello everybody, it's Eric Papenfuse. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. And last week I promised you a sneak peek of our new collectibles room at Midtown Scholar. So come on in and let's check it out together. You see, we're right outside and next to the original Scholar, but the collectible room has its own door and its own entrance. When you come in this way through the foyer, you'll see all the processing that's going on. This is very much a work in process, but it's going to be terrific when we're finished. One of my regrets about the current rare book room at the Midtown Scholar is that we have to keep a lot of things under lock and key. And this room is going to be different. We're going to have it staffed, and all the books that you see and all the pamphlets, like the ones that we discussed yesterday that are being processed, they'll all be available to touch and to browse. We're going to have a table and a book cradle. It'll be a different feel, but a really, really nice one. So this is the collectible room, and I thought today we could talk a little bit about ephemera. What is ephemera? Well, ephemera is usually paper items that weren't meant to last, and we have a lot of it here at the Scholar. If you see, we've got Victorian trade cards, and we've got Victorian die cuts. And here's an example of ephemera. This is a Victorian trade card. And what's interesting, it's advertising a product that can be purchased in a drugstore. And what's particularly interesting is that it could be purchased right here in this very building at Charles George's German Druggist at 1306 North 3rd Street, which is where we're standing. And even more interesting, we've got lots of postcards as well here, many with views of Harrisburg that you've probably never seen before, all reasonably priced, $3 to $5. This is a postcard of the very building that we're in. You can see that it had counters. It even sold postcards back at the turn of the century. And one of the neat features is, do you see the tin ceiling in the postcard from the turn of the century? Well, let's look up. And if you look up, you'll see we have the original ceiling here as pictured in this circa 19-teens postcard. We also have a lot of photography here in with ephemera. We have things called cartes de visite, which are these small format sort of Civil War era cards. This is Simon Cameron, owner of the Simon Cameron Mansion in Harrisburg, which is still existing today. And later on, they were replaced by a larger format card called a cabinet card. We've got lots of those cabinet cards for sale here. And this is E.J. Stackpole. It's actually signed by Stackpole, and he was a newspaper publisher here in Harrisburg, but he also founded Stackpole Books, which is still in business today, now on the West Shore. One of my personal favorite ephemera items are stereo views. We've got hundreds and hundreds of stereo views. This is a viewer, and what it does is it takes both of your eyes, combines them into one view, and it creates a 3D view, which is why these stereo views, let me show you one up close, have always two photos. And in some cases, these are always original photos and the only known photos of things. This is a photo of Shipoke and John Harris's grave. Do you see the fence there? That grave is still visible today in Harris Park. And some of these trees that you see planting in the stereo view are also still around today. This is 150 years old, and those trees are still there in Harris Park. All right, I wanted to do a book as well, and a fun book I thought today would be a book by one of our best-selling authors here at the Scholar, Charles Bukowski. This is his first novel. It's called The Post Office, and it's the story of his time working in the United States Postal Service. It's more than that, but it was published by Black Sparrow Press, and Black Sparrow Press was founded specifically to publish Bukowski's work. The founder of the press offered Bukowski a regular stipend if he would quit his job at the post office and write for them. And what's particularly interesting of this copy of Post Office is that it is signed by Bukowski, and it even has a doodle of a smoking monkey. Yes, that is a smoking monkey, and Bukowski artwork is very collectible in and of itself, but this is also his first novel. So this is actually going to go in the rare book room, but something which you'll find there in a more modern book than we usually do. And now finally, we want to end with a funny book. And this one, I have to say, was just found this week by our own Mitzi Trossel, who works in Books for the Store, processing them. And it is called The Layman's Guide to Acupuncture. Probably the one thing you don't really want a layman to do. And what I find particularly amusing about it is that it has photographs of how laymen can do acupuncture with fire sticks, and also acupuncture with electrolysis. So if you were ever a layman and wanted to do acupuncture in this manner, I think it would be a little bit dangerous, not to mention slightly scandalous. A Layman's Guide to Acupuncture. Well, thanks for watching. Thanks for taking a tour of this room. We hope to open it in the fall, and we will see you next week and every week on Friday for Buy Day Friday. Hello everybody, it's Eric Papenfuse. It's Friday again, so it must be a buy day, and today we're going to talk about a couple of new arrivals to our sort room here at Midtown Scholar. Let's get right to it. I wanted to talk today about a book which came in from Connecticut, which is a classic of English romantic poetry. It is The Prelude by William Wordsworth, and here is a copy of the title page. Now, this book was originally written in 1798, or started in 1798, and didn't get published till after Wordsworth's death in 1850. It was supposed to be an ode to his friend Coleridge, and it grew out of his and Coleridge's disillusionment with the French Revolution. Hard to really underestimate how disappointed the Romantics were with the promise of the Revolution turning into the Great Terror. It was a book that was a source of frustration for Wordsworth because he was unable to finish it during his lifetime. He kept working at it. He hoped it to be a blank verse that would rival Paradise Lost, would be sort of his generation, or Romanticism's version of Paradise Lost. And we did Paradise Lost on Buy Day a few weeks ago, so check that episode out. But rather than being the fall of humanity as its theme, his theme was himself. And it was autobiographical in nature. And it was a poem about how anyone's life could be perhaps the source of a great epic poem. And that in itself was very, very radical. Now, you will not be lonely as a cloud if you read The Prelude. And another interesting aspect about this is it allows us to talk about states of first editions. So back in the Victorian days, the publisher would print out a lot of copies and then it would have it bound as the book began to sell. Now, Wordsworth was the poet laureate of England, so this book sold very well. But each time new orders came in, the publisher would put in an updated list or a catalog list of the books that they had for sale. And this particular catalog list is noted as being July 1850. And there's some earlier catalog lists and some later catalog lists. And as a result, this is considered a first edition second state because it has the second oldest catalog. And unlike scholars, remember, book collectors tend to like the oldest or the most original form of a book. So a publisher's catalog's a means of determining the state of a first edition. And last week we took you to the Rare Book Room. I wanted to pull out one of our prints that we have at the Rare Book Room. There he is, Wordsworth, as an older man. Perhaps that's the prelude right there, available for sale in our print room, along with portraits of many fine British and American writers. The other book that I wanted to talk about today came in from a book sale, and it seemed rather nondescript. It's the Diary and Letters of Gouverneur Morris, who was a Pennsylvania delegate to the Constitutional Convention and was a gentleman who believed in a strong federal government. To tie it to Wordsworth, Gouverneur Morris was the ambassador to France during the French Revolution, and he was known for having a peg leg. And at one point, the mob came after him. They'd come after Lafayette, they'd come after Thomas Paine, and now they were coming after Gouverneur Morris. And apparently, according to his granddaughter, who wrote this recollection of his diary and letters, he took his peg leg off, waved it in the air, and said, "I lost this leg fighting for liberty in the American Revolution. Don't you come after me, mob." And the mob apparently backed off. And the problem with that story is that it is entirely apocryphal. Gouverneur Morris did not lose his leg fighting in the American Revolution. He lost it in a carriage accident. He did not serve in the American Army during the Revolution. In fact, he served in what was then considered the National Guard. He served in the New York Guard. And the fact that he served in the National Guard is probably what appealed to the owner of this particular book, who, if you open it up, you can see his bookplate, was Edward Martin. And Edward Martin was a general in the National Guard and a governor of Pennsylvania, who went on to become also a senator from Pennsylvania. And what's interesting about this bookplate is it shows the various aspects of his life up to that point: his time as governor, his time in legal practice, his time in private practice. It was common to have a bookplate designed in that time, and he was governor of Pennsylvania during World War II. He was such a proponent of the National Guard that when Martin died, the General Assembly determined that they would rename Fort Indiantown Gap after Edward Martin. And we're in Harrisburg. Fort Indiantown Gap is about 20 miles or so to the north of here. It's a training ground for the National Guard. The name didn't stick. The National Guard didn't like changing its name, and it's still called Fort Indiantown Gap today. But what they decided to do was they would name something else after Edward Martin. They would name the National Guard Research Library in D.C., the Edward Martin Memorial Library, which at first seems strange, but then when you realize he was an avid bibliophile, book collector, and reader, well, maybe it makes sense that the Memorial Library is now named after Edward Martin. This book is a good lesson in always checking the book plates in books and who owned it. At first glance, we bought it simply because we thought it was an interesting book about Gouverneur Morris, but once we learned more about who owned it and why, it became an even better story. All right, we're going to end today with a funny book, and I have to say I thought this book would hold the keys to life in it, and I was going to learn a lot, because who doesn't want a book entitled 101 Things I Wish I Knew when I started using hypnosis? So I was eager to read it. I opened it up. I was thinking it was going to teach me all these wonderful things, but no, in fact, its advice was very practical, including never begin hypnosis when either you or your patient needs to use the bathroom. So, so much for learning the secrets of life. But we'll be back next week for another edition of Buy Day Friday with a couple books that come in and a funny book as well. Thanks for watching. Remember to like us on YouTube and elsewhere, and leave your comments on Instagram. Thanks. Hey everybody, it's Eric Papenfuse. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day, and today we have a very special mystery edition of Buy Day Friday, because I need your help to let me know whether or not the two books I'm about to show you were owned by very famous people. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below this video. Let's get right to it. The first book we have is a beautiful book in what's called a Cambridge binding. That's this style of binding which is two-toned with a sort of rectangular series of impressions made by the binder. It was very common in England and Cambridge, and that's what we have here in the early 18th century. This is a book from 1713 on the method for attaining the knowledge and practice of arithmetic. Now, what's interesting about this book is that it may have been owned by a very famous individual, William Ellerslie. And if you look at the title page, it says William Ellerslie, 1767. Now, if it is the William Ellery, which we're trying to prove, he was a signer of both the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation from Rhode Island. Is a very famous individual, and anyone who signed the Declaration of Independence is a very, very collectible person. Now, I know the first thing you're saying is, well, wait a minute, it was published in London. How can you possibly tie it to America and to William Ellery in Rhode Island? And if you look at the title page, it was owned at one point by somebody named a John Drummond. Well, there's one more clue in this book, which is important, and that is in the back of the book. And in the back of the book, in someone else's hand, there's an inscription which says, William Ellery's, formerly belonging to John Drummond of Boston. So suddenly we have a connection to colonial America, which is in the back of the book. And if you look up John Drummond, which is an even more common name than William Ellery, there seems to be a number of John Drummonds or Drummonds who went to Harvard, and William Ellery also went to Harvard. So is it possible that it's a Harvard connection, a book that William Ellery picked up before the Revolution? Yes, I think it is. This could have been in Drummond's hand, and this could be in Ellery's hand himself. Now the problem is, the signature here looks nothing like William Ellery's signature on the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, on the Declaration of Independence, his signature is the second largest after John Hancock. So there is a question as to whether or not when you're performing a signature, maybe that's a little bit different than when you're signing your name in one of your books. The last clue that we have is the topic of the book, and this is a math book. It's not only about arithmetic, but it's about accounting practices, and this is exactly the type of book that somebody who worked in maybe a customs office would have had. And what Ellery was doing at this time in the 1760s and 1770s was he was working in a customs office in Newport, Rhode Island. So could this have been a working book which he used prior to the American Revolutionary period? I think the content works very well. Well, those are the clues that we have. Let me know. Do you think it was the William Ellery, or maybe a different William Ellery? And is the handwriting able to be proven or not? Now, the second book is a more modern book, but I have to say it's a similar dilemma. I've got it in this nice box here. This is a book by William Morris, the great arts and crafts designer of England. And it was published in America, in Chicago, in 1917 by the firm of Charles Kerr. Now, Charles Kerr was a socialist printing company in Chicago, and Morris was quite famous for being a socialist. And this is a very interesting novel because it's about a futuristic vision. It's sort of sci-fi. A guy wakes up in a dream, and it talks a little bit about the utopian socialist society. Again, it was published in Chicago, and the question is, somebody else was living in Chicago at that time, and that was the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. And could it be that this book was in fact owned by Frank Lloyd Wright? Now, we've got a couple problems right away with this signature. The common signature of Frank Lloyd Wright has those long horizontal lines that are very evocative of the sort of architecture which he did. It looks nothing like his signature. And it also says that it was signed in Fresno, California. We don't have a lot to go on, but I can tell you that Frank Lloyd Wright was in California in 1917, which is the year that this book was published, because that's the year that he took a boat to Japan. You couldn't fly to Japan at those times, and stayed there for the next 3 years designing a number of influential projects in Japan. He also was well known to have designed a number of works in the Fresno area. In fact, I was just Googling, and if you want, you can go experience Frank Lloyd Wright as part of the Fresno Art Museum art tour. You can get wine cheese and go look at his houses. So Frank Lloyd Wright certainly knew Fresno, California. But the main issue is we don't have a match on the signature. But could this have been the type of light reading? By the way, there's also an FLW on the top of the book, which he maybe read on the boat ride over to Japan. And could his signature in a personal book be something that's very different from his signature on a formal document? The fact of the matter is that if this is the Frank Lloyd Wright, this is probably the preeminent 20th century designer owning a work by the preeminent 19th century designer. It's a very desirable thing, and the book goes from being worth, say, $20 as a book to maybe $2,000, so that's why it's important. Ellery's a similar thing. That book's a $100 book, or it's maybe a $1,500 book if it's really owned by the signer of the Declaration of Independence. So let me know your thoughts. Obviously, there's more research that can be done, but I'd like to know whether you think we've got a case or we should just give up. It's pretty fun. Both of those came from booksellers. One came from a bookseller in New Jersey very recently, and neither had done anything with the previous ownership. All right, we're gonna end on a funny book. Are you ready? One of my favorites, been here for a while. It's Practical Horse Massage. Now, listen, I like massage as much as the next guy, and I would never begrudge a massage for a horse. However, the question is whether or not horse massage is particularly practical. And I have to say, we have picture after picture of folks doing rather incredible things, including standing on blocks of woods and stools and reaching over horses and dressing. But the most important thing is that there's a disclaimer at the beginning of this book. And I just want to read you the disclaimer because it does call into question the whole topic of the book. And the disclaimer starts, if your horse pins his ears, picks up a back leg, or otherwise seems like he may want to flatten you, stop what you're doing immediately and reassess. Well, maybe not for everyone, but for certainly some people. Practical horse massage. All right, looking forward to your comments, and we'll see you next week on Buy Day Friday. Hello everybody, it's Eric Papenfuse. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day, and today I want to talk about a story about last Friday. If you follow us on Instagram, you'll know that we were up in Connecticut cleaning out the remaining books in Elliot's book barn. If you recall, a couple months ago, we did a buy day from up in the barn. Well, the barn is now empty, and you can see photos of the empty barn if you go to our Instagram account. Well, we finished about noon. I was feeling good, and I wanted something to do for the rest of the afternoon. So what do you do when you finish cleaning out a book barn? You go to another book barn, especially if you love books. So we drove to Whitlock's book barn, which is about 20 minutes away, just north of New Haven. And in the car ride over, I turned on the news and I heard the story of the overturn of Roe v. Wade and the Supreme Court's ruling. This was devastating. I was deeply upset, and I want to say clearly that the bookstore's position on this is that we oppose the Supreme Court's decision. And I'm going to tell you partly why that decision was wrong. But I got to the book barn, I started browsing, and I saw a small stack of books by the register that were sort of out of the public view and had been set aside. And a good lesson whenever browsing, see if you can find the books that haven't yet been processed, because they might contain some real gems. And I said, could I look at those books in the pile? And here we're going to open them up, and we're going to see one of those books. And the owner of the bookstore said, sure, you can see it. The book, though, is missing its cover. And as a result, we were thinking about having it repaired. And I'm like, well, that's all right. What's the book? And lo and behold, the book was something I'd never really seen before from that time period. It is A History of Abortion, containing an account in which it takes place and the causes and everything else related to abortion. An entire book on that topic, a second edition, meaning it had gone through multiple editions, published in 1809, right in the early period of American Federalist era. So a shocking discovery, but a timely one on the day. Now, one of the things that really upset me about Alito's opinion is that he said, in the opinion, there was a long history of the criminalization of abortion in America, dating way back to prior to the Constitution. And this is part of the doctrine called originalism, which says that we ought to give credence to the beliefs that the founders had at the time they wrote the Constitution. Now, there's a lot of problems with originalism as an interpretive doctrine. A lot of people who believe in the right to choice would simply say, why do we care what these founders thought? They didn't believe in women's rights. They believed in slavery. Originalism doesn't matter. But the fact of the matter is, he's not even right about his understanding of history, because at the time, abortion was not criminalized in America or Britain. And in fact, it was commonplace, and doctors and midwives performed it all of the time. There was something, a doctrine which said that prior to the quickening, abortion could happen without any complications at all, The quickening is defined as that moment, maybe 14, 15, 16 weeks into pregnancy, when the mother can feel the movement of the fetus in her body, and that was defined at the time as the beginning of life, not conception. The quickening. And an example of why that matters, or why that was commonly held, here's a sort of morbid example, but if at the time you were sentenced to hang because you committed a crime and you were a woman, if you were pregnant but had not yet reached the quickening, off to the gallows you went. But if you had reached the quickening, they had to wait to execute you until after you'd given birth. And Blackstone writes about this in the commentaries of the time, and the quickening was defined as a critical moment. This book that we found, however, further explains just how commonplace abortion is. It is treated as it should be in medical terms. It's described here, the contents is something which is quite commonplace, and this is a guide mainly written for midwives and doctors to understand how it happens. But he does even go further than that, and the author says, in no uncertain terms, nothing that he writes, I do not wish from this observation or any other to be understood in any way disapproving of those necessary attempts which are occasionally made to procure premature labor or even abortion when the safety of the mother demands this interference. So obviously the safety of the mother was paramount to doctors at the time, and I would describe abortion as being seen as something of a necessary evil, but not something which was criminal or deserved punishment. So the question is, when does this change in American history? And how does it change? And why does it change? And the answer lies in the Second Great Awakening. And to overly simplify the Second Great Awakening, let me just say in American history, there was a long-standing concept of sin, which basically said we're all sinners, and a belief in predestination, and an understanding there wasn't a lot that an individual could do to sort of change one's fate. Second Great Awakening sort of upends that, and instead of saying we're all sinners, it says that maybe someone else could be a sinner and you could act in ways that could get you into heaven. And I'm going to refer you to a book called The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution by my mentor, David Davis, which talks about how slavery itself changed from being a necessary evil to being a positive good because of these changing conceptions of sin. And something very similar happens with abortion. And it happens in America very specifically due to one other thing, which has to do with a charismatic preacher and a sex scandal. You can't get any more American than that. Because in 1817, a gentleman, a minister by the name of Ammi Rogers, well, he goes on a house call to a dying woman, and he ends up impregnating that woman's granddaughter. And then he gets sentenced to jail. Why? Because he provides her with the medicine necessary to have an abortion. So you have a charismatic preacher of the Second Great Awakening in the early days of the Second Great Awakening impregnating a woman, and somebody had to be punished. Now, he ends up going to jail for 2 years for sexual assault. Not a very steep punishment, considering he could have gotten life at the time for sexual assault. And then he spends the rest of his life saying he didn't do it. And he writes memoir after memoir like this one, in which he basically says he was falsely accused. He was really just imprisoned because he didn't believe in the blurring of church and state. We won't get into that discussion because the Supreme Court has clearly blurred that recently as well. But that's what Ammi Rogers has to say. And what's interesting is the New Jersey legislature takes up the case, and they pass, in response to this case, the first laws restricting abortion anywhere in the country, even though that law also only criminalizes it after the quickening. So it is post-quickening, and unfortunately, that law in New Jersey, it blames not the perpetrator, but the woman. And the woman can, and this is the history for where we are today. That was the first law in the United States to do it. It was the Second Great Awakening. Somebody had to be punished. Ammi Rogers, by the way, he blames the doctor for the potion for the abortion. He doesn't dispute that the woman is pregnant and has an abortion. He just says that the doctor gives her the medicine, not him. And that does also support the fact that, in general, doctors had no problem with dispensing medicine for inducing an abortion at that time. fascinating history, and that's how we got to where we are in the United States. Now, listen, I'm a believer that old books can teach you a lot about our nation's history, and I encourage people to read books like this and not simply take for granted the word of a Supreme Court justice on what happened in American history. All right. If you're a watcher of this show, you know we like to end with a funny book. And we're going to end with a funny book today, even though it's been a serious topic. And last week, we did horse massage. So in keeping with horse massage and our desire to make fun of someone, we're going to make fun of lawyers, specifically horse lawyers, because I found this book also at the Whitlock's Book Barn called The Law and Your Horse. Now, if this were written in 1904, that would make some sense, but it was actually written in 1972. So shocking to believe that these were the questions on the minds of the horse lawyer in 1972. If a stray horse trespasses upon my property, do I have the right to keep him? If I run over a horse running loose on a public highway, am I liable for damages? If my horse dies while under the care of a veterinarian, can the doctor be sued for malpractice? Such are the stories in horse law, the law and your horse. Well, thanks for watching. We'll be back next week and every week on Friday for another edition of Buy Day. See you then. Hey everybody, it's Eric Papenfuse. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. And today I want to take you along on a book call that we did, a house call this past week in Princeton, New Jersey. We drove up a driveway to an 18th century farmhouse, and inside there were floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and it was just a wonderful experience. There was American literature in the 20th century, A to Z. We found all sorts of amazing books like Gravity's Rainbow and Midnight's Children and Slaughterhouse-Five. And the reason we found such great books is because this was the home of a book reviewer for Time magazine by the name of Paul Gray. And he passed away a number of years ago. His widow invited us out to the house, and many of the copies in his library were his own review copies that he had received from the publisher. One such review copy was Margaret Atwood's A Handmaid's Tale, and you can see the original publisher's card that came with that book. And I told his widow that I was going to go back and read some of the reviews that he wrote, and it was really interesting to go back into the Time magazine archives and read the reviews, because Paul Gray did a lot to popularize some of these authors in the public mind by writing for Time. And one author who he really loved was Margaret Atwood. And I pulled his review of this copy of this book from the Time magazine archives, and he really put Atwood on the map because he compared her to Huxley and Orwell, and that was really good company for this Canadian author at the time. He wrote, "To a remarkable degree, these two books have staked out the turf of contemporary anti-utopias." He's talking about Brave New World and 1984. "Which punishment is it to be this time? Relentless, inescapable totalitarianism, or the mindless synthetic stupors of technology? As it turns out, Atwood's look at the future takes place under conditions that Orwell would recognize. Repression is the order of the new day in The Handmaid's Tale, but the villains in this piece are not the ones that Orwell accused, and the most prominent victim and hero is a woman." So a great review in Time magazine puts this book on the map. It's an interesting book because when you're collecting first editions, there are three to choose from. You can choose from the American first edition, which is what this is, the Canadian first edition, which was actually earlier and more collectible, or the British first edition. But none of those three editions is the most valuable edition of A Handmaid's Tale, because that just sold last month at Sotheby's for over $100,000. And you know what it was? It was a special fireproof edition of A Handmaid's Tale. And for your viewing enjoyment, here is a picture, zoom in, of Margaret Atwood with a flamethrower attempting to burn A Handmaid's Tale. Hint, it does not burn, and it sells at auction for £100,000. So another interesting point, and man, I'm going to put you on the spot. You're filming this. Which of these four modern first editions do you think is actually the most valuable? Take your guess.
I'm going to say Slaughterhouse-Five.
Okay, Slaughterhouse-Five is an excellent guess, and it is probably the second most valuable. But the most valuable is, in fact, Gravity's Rainbow, and that's because this book has an almost cult-like following, and It's an extraordinarily popular book online. So Gravity's Rainbow, the most valuable in this group, a little bit about modern fifth editions and a little bit about Time Magazine reviewer Paul Gray. If you get a chance to go back and read any of his reviews of these books, you should. They're terrific. One other book to look at this week was one that came in from Connecticut. I found it really interesting because we've been talking about social mores last week about abortion. Well, here is the first book about the commercial production of wine in America, and it is called The Vine Dresser's Manual, and it is illustrated. Look at that amazing illustration. And this book teaches anyone how to start their own vineyard and to create their own wine. It was written by Charles Remelin, and it was published, he was originally from Ohio. And did you know that at the time, and this is pre-Civil War, the first successful commercial wineries in the United States were in Ohio? I had no idea. They were founded by German immigrants like Remelin. One interesting fact is that, of course, after the Civil War comes the temperance movement and prohibition, which wipes out the Ohio wine industry, and it still hasn't recovered. But at the time, in 1855, it was the place. This book is interesting because it talks about how it's going to bring wine to the masses, and the temperance movement in America was really founded on a couple of negative points: anti-immigration and a sort of classist ideology, and this book embodies both. So here's a German immigrant writing about wine, and here's a German immigrant writing about how wine is good for the masses, and it talks about the positive health aspects of wine. It's an illustrated book. It's really interesting. One more thing, our friends at Bowman Rare Books think that this book is actually worth more than all those books combined. I can't say I believe that, but we sold a book to Bowman's this past week, one of our early orations from the new print room, pamphlet room, but they think this book is more valuable than those combined, and it is actually a very interesting book. All right, we are going to end today on a funny note, and we're going to revisit a previous episode of Buy Day. If you were watching when we went to the State College Library sale, you'll know that I took out a book and made a little bit of fun of crafting with cat hair. Well, I shouldn't have done that because the viewer response has been strong. People do craft with cat hair, and today, instead of a book, I want to show you this delightful item brought to us by one of our very own bookstore employees, Mitzi Trossel. Yes, that is a cat made out of cat hair. And also, for your viewing enjoyment, I hope you will please enjoy the following video. Well, that was something. We'll be back next week and every week on Friday for another edition of Buy Day Friday, talking about books that come in here to the sort room at Midtown Scholar, the book trade, and why books in general are important. Hello, everybody. I'm Eric Papenfuse. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. And today, I want to take you on a trip that we made last week to Newtown, Connecticut, to the Booth Library Sale, one of the largest library sales in all of New England. We went up there and they had not one, not two, but three gymnasiums full of books. And we bought about 1,500 books and packed them in our minivan to take back to Midtown Scholar. There's some of them that are awaiting processing for the shop right now. But unlike other library sales, they also had a rare book gymnasium, which was a lot of fun. And they charged an admission. You had to pay $40 to go to this library sale, and they capped the number of people at 200. It was an all-day event. We had to camp out the night before and put our boxes out. I wanted to show you some of the great finds that we found in Newtown. So one book which immediately caught my eye was this incredible French Bible. And get ready, because it's amazing. It was published in 1668 in France, and I got the table out today, so we have a little bit more room to examine this. And it's just a wonderful, beautiful, holy Bible. And if you look at the book, there is the engraved title page. Now, the Bible itself is in excellent condition with engravings. The paper looks really wonderful. But one of the reasons it was left behind by the other dealers was because the boards have come off and the leather has come off. But to me, this was a great advantage because it allows us to once again talk about exciting things like binder's waste and how books were put together in the 17th century. So here's the leather covering that goes over the board. And then if you look at the board, you'll see that the board itself has old paper pasted onto it between the leather here and the board. This is called binder's waste, and binders were notorious for taking bits of old books and reusing them in new books like the Bible. What's interesting about this binder's waste is it has these illuminated letters. Do you see them there? That harkens back to an earlier time, and I think there's a chance that this is from what's called an incunable, which is a book from the very early years of printing. Illuminated pages like this in and of themselves can be very valuable. It appears to be a book on the law, and you have this interesting blending of the sacred text and the secular in how the book was constructed. And you weren't meant to see this, but now that the bindings come apart, you can see it, and we can do some research and find out more about the book. But if you zoom right in, as close as possible, you can see a little bit about what we're talking. The book also has areas that are packed into the spine with old manuscripts, and I just love this. But you can see these old manuscripts that were used to basically strengthen the spine where the leather meets the book. And I haven't had a chance to look at these yet. I'm going to take them out and examine them, but we may be able to tell more about these could be the account records for the printer himself as he was keeping track of the sale of the Bible. Now, another reason that books like this were passed by other dealers, I think not only is it a lot of work, and this is not a book that we're going to have restored. A few weeks ago, we went to Tony the bookbinder. I'm going to leave this one as it is and let people use it as sort of a teaching tool for how books are put together. But Bibles themselves are very common. When you think about it, it's the most popular book in the world in many respects, and so they don't have a lot of value. A book like this, even with the interest, is still only worth a few $100s, but it's certainly a sight to behold and a really neat find for the library sale. All right, from Newtown to Newton, because on the way up to the Newtown library sale, we stopped by our favorite bookstore in New Jersey, and would you believe it, but I found on the shelf a copy of a book by Sir Isaac Newton, and this is a remarkable find. This is a copy of Newton's Optical Lectures that was published immediately after his death in 1728. Newton had just died in 1727. Now, Newton died intestate. That means he didn't have a will, and people rummaged through his papers, and this was basically the lecture course he gave at Cambridge on optics, which eventually became one of his great works. It was basically transcribed from notes that he had made in his hand and that some others had made at the time. It's illustrated with these wonderful engravings, and you can see some of the Newtonian, and it's got this sort of fold-out method where the engraving extends past the book, and you can see some of what Newton is talking about it. Books by Isaac Newton are very rare, and this gives me an opportunity to talk about the strange fate of Isaac Newton's library. So when he died in 1727 without the will, all of the books in his library, about 1,800 books, were put up for auction. And believe it or not, they were all purchased by a prison warden who was the head of the jail, the Fleet Street Prison in London. And this is the famous prison that's in the Pickwick Papers. It's in Hogarth engravings. It was a debtor's prison, and it was the worst of conditions, and people really suffered in the jail. All 1,800 books, the prison warden paid £300 for, which is an amazing deal when you think about it. And he raised the money by selling his wardenship to another gentleman who ended up basically becoming warden by buying it. You could do it at those days. He sold his wardenship for £3,000 and spent $300 of it on Newton's library. The warden who purchased the wardenship ends up going to jail for being a sadist and abusing the prisoners. So it is really a terrible situation if you're a debtor in 18th century London at that point. He buys the library for his son, the prison warden does, who is going to become a rector at a small parish church. And little does he know that he's really not buying the right library for a person of the cloth, because it's filled with heretical books and books on alchemy and all the sort of wonderful things that Newton has. After his son, the rector, dies, the next rector of the church ends up buying the Newton library. And his name, it doesn't really matter what his name is, he ends up putting his own bookplate in all 1,800 of the books. It was Musgrave was the name, but he puts his own bookplate in. And then over the next 100 years, by the time you get to the 20th century, the connection to Newton is lost, and nobody remembers it until a researcher basically ends up sort of trying to trace back and find Newton's 1,800 books. And about 700 of the books are sold off at auction, and people don't know where they are. And one of the greatest COVID stories that I remember from the book trade is that there was a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder who discovered that he had a bookplate like this in one of his books in his library, did some research, spoke to Newton scholars, and determined it was Newton's own copy of his famous book on optics, and it was just discovered just last year. So there are about 700 missing Newton books out there. Many are presumed to be in America, and maybe you too can find a copy of a Newton book someday. And it's just possible enough because I never dreamed I would find a copy of a book by Isaac Newton at a bookstore in New Jersey, en route to Newtown. All right, you ready to end with a funny one? We're going to end with a funny book, and this book from Newtown, well, it's Sloth Love. And I've got to say, one interesting fact about sloths, and I love sloths. When I was growing up, they had a sloth at the National Aquarium in Baltimore, and we'd always go and try and find it, hiding among the greenery there. But one interesting fact about sloths is that they can fall from a tree and survive a fall of up to 100 feet, which is a remarkable testament to their gravitational forces abilities. But it is important to note that sloths also, and there's a cute picture, define Newton's first law, which is that an object at rest likes to stay at rest. Sloth Love, today's funny book. Thanks for watching. We'll be back next week and every week with more adventures from the book trade. Hello everybody, it's Friday, so it must be a buy day, and today, as always, we're going to talk about a couple interesting new arrivals right here at the sort room of Midtown Scholar. Let's get right to it today. Now, the first book we're going to talk about is a book by a gentleman named Samuel Benner. Now, if you can zoom in on this cover, you might be a little bit confused because we have a guy on top of a bunch of iron bars which are hovering above some pigs eating corn and a pile of money. Well, what are Benner's prophecies, you might ask? Well, this was the first book to talk about how to predict price cycles and speculate in the stock market. And it came out under the name of Samuel Benner, who was an Ohio farmer. And this might remind you of a couple weeks ago, we had a book by an Ohio farmer. That farmer was teaching you how to do vineyards. This farmer is teaching you how to pick stocks. Now, in order to understand this book, you have to understand the Panic of 1873. And the Panic of 1873 in American history wiped out Samuel Benner, wiped out his fortune, that is, and caused him to move from farming to prognosticating. And it happened really for three reasons in American history. One, we were in a period of rampant speculation in railroad stocks post the Civil War, and all that sort of came crashing down in 1873. Two, we had two of our most important cities in America burned to the ground, Boston and Chicago. And this caused an enormous strain on the insurance industry. And three, we had a sort of anti-silver turn to the gold standard, which caused a depression in the silver markets worldwide. And anyhow, it caused a worldwide economic depression. But in this depression, Benner saw patterns. And he believed that you could predict stocks and where they would go based on if you could get the cycles correct. And these were called price cycles. And he began to predict when the stocks would go up and when the stocks would go down, when commodity pricings would go up, when they would go down. And he did it based on an understanding of historical data and the weather. Poppycock, you say? Well, no, The Benner cycle is still used today. Here's an example of the Benner cycle, that very same cycle you saw on the chart, accurately predicting the current economic recession that we're in and saying things really aren't going to get better until 2035. Well, if you trust an Ohio farmer from the 1870s to tell you that, you could. The goal, of course, in any type of speculation is to buy when stocks or commodities are at their low and to be able to sell when they're at their high. It's called the Benner cycle today. It's still in use, and this was the first book to really popularize that. It went through many different editions, and it sold extremely well because he not only used a mix of historic data, but he also used biblical prophecy. When you mix those together in the 1870s and 1880s, it was really something. Benner's prophecies. All right, from that book to a different type of book, a more modern book that you might know, and that is the famous Hermann Rorschach Psychodiagnostics Test. And you probably know Rorschach. He was a great studier of human thought and behavior, and he developed a test whereby people would look at ink block prints and their various answers could tell you about their personalities. He invented this test in the 1920s, but the book was then translated into English by this publishing firm here of Hans Huber, and it became a sensation really throughout the world, especially in America in the 1940s and the 1950s. You know, in the 1940s, Amanda, they were using this test to try and determine the thought of Nazi prisoners and how we could get at the root causes of evil just by having people look. Now, I don't know if you've ever actually taken a Rorschach test, but there are 10, count them, 10 different cards, and depending on what you see in the cards, it tells you really about the perceptions of the viewer. So Amanda, I'm going to put you on the spot. What do you see in this test?
I saw two bears like dancing together.
Do you really see two bears? Okay, well that means that you're entirely normal, because that is the most popular answer, believe it or not, is two bears dancing. Now I have to say, when I looked at this, I did not see two bears dancing. I saw a face, and sometimes people can see a face, and you can see all sorts of different things. But Rorschach developed a scoring system, and some were in color and some were in black and white. And depending on your answer, you could basically be diagnosed with certain personality traits. Now, there's some truth to it. It's not necessarily as wacky as the Benner cycle, although the Benner cycle is still in use today. But what happened is people started using it for all sorts of pseudoscientific purposes, and it really ran out of fashion by the 1960s, and so I imagine today it's not very much in use. But there was a recent study which showed that if you use it the way Rorschach intended the test to be used, you can develop a lot of interesting information about people's personalities. So the Rorschach test, the first time I've seen it. Also, one other little fun thing about this book is there was a time when these plates were kept under lock and key because they didn't want everybody to see them, and they wanted them to be fresh when people were diagnosing them. So I've sort of spoiled that by showing you just one of the 10. And also, this particular book was a graduation gift, which is really sort of interesting, to a woman by the name of Molly, what does that say, Merman, in New York in 1946. But it's fun because it's signed by all of her classmates. So you can imagine a graduation gift. Can you have a graduation party in which everyone's giving themselves the Rorschach test and determining their personalities? I bet that happened in the 1940s New York party that this was about. Maybe she was going to medical school. So, Hermann Rorschach. All right. Finally, a funny book, and we're going to end with basically the Rorschach test for cats. Yes, that's right. It is Why Cats Paint. Now, I know I'm treading on thin ice and going back to our feline friends, but I want you to meet some of them, including our friends Tiger and Misty. And if you look very closely, this is Tiger, who is obviously an abstract expressionist cat, and here's Misty, and Misty is very good with painting as well, a different style. Now, this book argues the cats paint for aesthetic purposes, but the part that really got me the most is that it also claims an entire chapter that the way cats destroy your furniture at home is really artistic expression, and that if you look at the tears of your sofa, you can read them like a Rorschach test. So, Amanda, what do you see there?
a really big mouth?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, yes, actually, that's right. Yes, it is. It is a face. Those are eyes, and that's a mouth, and that was deliberately done by the cat. What do you see there, Amanda?
I don't even know.
Well, I can't tell you. I can't tell you what they believe they see there. That is for you to discover when you pick up Why Cats Paint, a Theory of Feline Aesthetics. Well, thanks for watching. We'll be back next week and every week at Friday for another edition of Buy Day. Next week, we're going to take you on a visit to our rare book room, not to be confused with the new collectibles room, and we're going to talk about two of the most popular authors of 19th century America and how to collect their books. Hello everybody, I'm Eric Papenfuse. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day, and as promised, we're here at the Midtown Scholar to show you the rare book room. We've talked a lot about the upcoming collectibles room, which is opening in the fall, but the rare book room is very much open for business right now. And if you come on in, the first thing you're going to notice on the way to the rare book room, and we're here at the Scholar Underground, is we've got a little exhibit about how the bookstore used to be an old Boston department store, and we contrast pictures of what it looked like back in the 1950s with what it looks like today. You have to make your way by the historical pictures in order to come into the rare book room. And fun fact, we actually had to tunnel between our two buildings and took out just cubic foot after cubic foot of dirt and gravel to be able to make this passageway. We are now underneath the building on the corner rather than underneath the main bookstore. But the rare book room is designed to have books from all over the world. They're arranged by geographic point of origin. So this is the British history bookcase with all sorts of British imprints. Similarly, we have a French imprint case and a European one. And throughout the rare book room, even though the books are kept under lock and key, we do have a number of exhibits. So you can come and you can read about, for instance, Cambridge style bindings or Samuel Johnson's English Dictionary. And it's designed so that you can browse it, and if you see something you'd like to see, we can unlock the case. One of the reasons we're doing the collectible room is because we don't want to have to always have books locked away, and we want you to be able to hold them and touch them. But these are some of the more valuable books, and at least we have glass windows and ways in which to look at them. So today we're going to talk about the literary debuts of two of the most famous authors in the 19th century. And we happen to have in our special collections here, and I'm going to open one of the cases for you, examples of first editions by Mark Twain and Jules Verne. So let's start a little bit with Mark Twain and Mark Twain's literary debut. And a few months back now, we purchased the inventory of a bookstore up in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, from a gentleman named Alan Angela, and he was downsizing, and inside his bookstore, he had a wonderful collection of runs of American periodicals, such as Harper's Magazine. Many of these volumes, there's hundreds of them, are going to be in the new collectibles room. They're all available for about $20 a piece, and they're really great time capsules of the literature of the 19th century in America. But some of them are more valuable, including this particular edition from 1866, because it contains the literary debut of Mark Twain. And let me just read you what Mark Twain wrote about his literary debut, because he wrote about that. He said, "In those very early days, I'd already published one little thing about a jumping frog in an Eastern paper, but I did not consider that counted. In my view, a person who published things in a mere newspaper could not properly claim to be recognized as a literary person. He must rise way above that. He must appear in a magazine. He would only be a literary person then, and also he'd become famous right away, and those two ambitions were strong upon me. And this was 1866, so I prepared my contribution, and then I looked around for the very best magazine to go up to glory in. And I selected the most important one in New York, and the contribution was accepted, and I signed it Mark Twain, for that name had some currency on the Pacific coast, and it was my idea to spread the name all over the world now and in this one jump. Now the article appeared in the December number, and then I waited a month for the January number, for that would be the one that would contain the list of contributors. And so this is the yearly volume with all of the monthlies put together, and here you can see the article that he waited up to see, 43 days in an open boat. But it doesn't have his name in it because he had to wait for the index in the last volume of the year to do that. And he got it. And if you continued reading his account, you'd see he looked for his name and he searched for his name. And oh dear, they misspelled it. Mark Swain. Well, it was a fresh named Eastern Printers, and they put it as Mark Swain. At any rate, I was not celebrated, and I did not give a banquet. I was a literary person, but that was all a buried one, buried alive. So the literary debut of Mark Twain, they didn't get his name right. And that's what makes this Harper's Monthly magazine pretty collectible. Now, the literary debut of Jules Verne is a whole different story. Jules Verne was perhaps the most translated author in the 19th century, and definitely is the second most translated author in the world today. Fun trivia question, Amanda. You want to guess who the most translated author in the world is? Any idea?
I have no clue.
Okay, all right. Well, it could be like J.K. Rowling could be coming up, but it is Agatha Christie, believe it or not. But Jules Verne is the second most, and he published most of his books, obviously in French, and they were all part of a collection called The Extraordinary Voyages. And he had this amazing deal with a French printer. I'm going to show you the name of the French printer and how they were published right there. To basically put them together in one sort of continuing chronology of a few stories every year, teaching you about the world and science and adventure and all these great things. And he ended up writing over 54 books in the series, Extraordinary Adventures, including all the famous ones that we know, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Around the World in 80 Days, Journey to the Center of the Earth. They were all part of the series, and the series was lavishly done, well illustrated in the French, and really brought him great fame in France. And so people collect them. They were first published in magazine form, just like Twain, and then compiled into these books. The problem came when they were to be translated into English and sent to the American market. And the American market basically determined that Jules Verne was a children's author, and that this science fiction stuff really needed to be dumbed down for a younger audience. So here's an example of an American edition of Around the World in 80 Days. Now, you remember some weeks back, we talked about Charles Dickens and his frustration with copyright and how Americans would just rush to take his books and put them in print. Well, the same thing happened with Jules Verne. Copyright hadn't improved. American publishers could do whatever they wanted. And not only did they market the books for children, but they translated them and they left out entire passages. And in some cases, they did certain things, like Nemo, the great explorer. He had some not so great things to say about the British Empire, gone in the English editions. Some of entire chapters of Jules Verne were erased. Certain characters, for instance, in American translations, were made to be things like anti-Semitic when they weren't at all in Jules Verne's works. So it's only been recently that Jules Verne's works have undergone a new series of translations, and they've discovered all these discrepancies. So if you haven't read Jules Verne in a while, or you remember just these great editions from your youth, read them again as an adult, because he wanted his reputation to be that of a great literary author, and it should be, and it's been restored in some of the new translations today. We've got a great selection of Jules Verne here, both in French and English, in the rare book room of the Midtown Scholar. Okay, well, we are going to end today on a funny book. Are you ready? It is Nigerian Dwarf Goat Care. And if you've been wondering certain questions about Nigerian dwarf goats, well, you can have your answers here. For instance, will my goats be okay if I feed them commercial pellets? Oh, no, they will not be. Can I let my goats graze in the yard or pasture? Well, you better be careful. How often can I breed my Nigerian dwarf goats? Well, apparently it's only about 25 times a year. Who knew that? All right. Well, this reminded me of a Mark Twain story, so I think we're going to end with that, because in Roughing It, he has a great story about an old guy, Mr. Jim Blaine, and here's a copy of it, who tells a story about a goat. Okay, it's a ram. It's not a Nigerian dwarf goat, but it's the same thing. But he can only tell the story when he gets really, really drunk. So he gets really, really drunk. He starts to tell the story. We hear about cannibals. We hear about adventures. We hear about all sorts of things. And then suddenly he falls asleep. And we never really find out about grandfather's great goat. So that's your story today. Next week, we'll be back with a whole new edition of Buy Day, and we're going to talk, rather than literary debuts, we're going to talk about literary reviews and some of the bad reviews that famous authors got. See you next week on Buy Day Friday. Hello everybody, it's Eric Papenfuse again. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day, and today we're going to talk about book reviews, and not the type of book reviews that Paul Gray used to write that we talked about a couple weeks ago for Time magazine that introduced books to the sort of popular audience. We're going to talk about academic reviews, the bane of every academic's existence. And to do that, I wanted to talk about one of the most famous reviews ever written of an academic book, and it was published in this, The Quarterly Review, in 1860. And we recently got a copy of this quarterly review to come in. Normally journals and reviews are not things that people say, but this was one that was worth saving because it was an anonymous review published in 1860, if you look in here, on Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species. Now, at the time this review was anonymous, people didn't know who wrote it, but it was actually written and revealed later to be written by a man by the name of Samuel Wilberforce, known as Soapy Sam, a bishop in the Anglican Church, and he did not like Darwin's theory one bit. In fact, it culminates, and it's a very long review, it goes on for tens of thousands of words, but culminates in this basic argument, which is, and he does the normal niceties of saying Darwin is a good writer, he's making an interesting case, he has lots of interesting things to say, but we can explain all this. We don't need natural selection. We don't need evolution. We can explain all this. Why? Well, we can explain all this by the simplest and yet the most comprehensive answer, by declaring the stupendous fact that all creation is the transcript in matter of ideas eternally existing in the mind of the Most High. That's right. That was all that was needed. Now, interestingly, we know that Darwin read this review because he had a copy of the Quarterly Review. And do you know what he wrote in the margin right there when Wilberforce was talking about the mind of the Most High? He wrote, mere words, mere words. So we also know he wrote the review because he corresponded with a gentleman by the name of Thomas Huxley. And Thomas Huxley was outraged by this review, and they played sort of guess the author. Originally they thought it was somebody else, but Huxley basically said, how on earth could the reviewer basically call you, Darwin, a flighty person who endeavors to prop up his utterly rotten fabric of guess and speculation, and whose mode of dealing with nature is reprobated as utterly dishonorable to natural science. Huxley was very, very upset. Darwin said, you know what, I don't have a lot of time to spend with reviews. I've got my research to do. But Huxley took up the fight. And what's really interesting is that Huxley bumped into Wilberforce when the two of them were at Oxford. And again, this is before he knew that Wilberforce had written that review. And a famous exchange is had at Oxford in which Wilberforce turns to Huxley and says to Huxley, are you descended by apes on your grandfather's side or your grandmother's side? And Huxley says to Wilberforce, well, I'd rather be descended from an ape than somebody like you. And that was reported in all the newspapers at the time. So that's the original reception of Charles Darwin's The Origin of the Species. If we go back 30 years to the 1830s, the most famous scientist in all of England was a scientist by the name of Michael Faraday. And he's famous for inventing words like ion and cathode and all things having to do with electrolysis, electricity, ventilation, you name it. And he worked at an institution called the Royal Institution, which was basically a big social club for scientists in England. And even Faraday, though, had his critics. And at one point, he did the rather small thing of simply changing out all the lights in the reading room, in the public spaces at the Royal Institution, from oil lamps to gas lamps. And boy, did that cause a stir among all the old fuddy-duddies who were on the board. In fact, they were so upset that they wrote Faraday a series of questions. And they printed it in a letter. And they basically said, why has oil been displaced by gas in the public rooms of the Royal Institution? And then they asked him all sorts of gotcha questions like, well, what is the ratio of light from an oil and a gas burner? And what's the ratio of heat? And all these things. Well, Faraday was not deterred. He patiently answered all the questions, and he said things, well, like oil is not as good to burn as gas, because gas burns at a rate of 21 to 13 in terms of being brighter. Gas is brighter than oil. And in terms of heat, gas is 3 to 2 in terms of generates more heat. And he goes on, and he talks about ventilation and why all these things are necessary for the Royal Institution. And then, as the final answer to his reviews from the old fuddy-duddies, he mails it to each of them. And this is actually folded and sent as a letter so that they can learn a little bit about science. Interestingly enough, he basically, they were all complaining that they liked the light from the oil lamps better, but he was saying, you know, if we don't get better ventilation in here, we're going to have a fire or we're going to have an explosion. And Faraday is famous because he investigated sort of the disasters of this Victorian period, including a huge explosion in a coal mine in England, which he was the first to attribute to the fact that there were dust particles, coal particles in the air. And he developed a ventilation system which nobody really paid any attention to in the 19th century, but is now a standard part of mining today. So Michael Faraday dealing with his reviewers and writing his response, Charles Darwin writing his response. Well, we're going to end today with a funny book, and I've got to say it's about time that we start making some fun of 1940s and 1950s advertising. And here is a fantastic book, Getting the Most Out of Your Lathe. And I think what I like most about this book is that, of course, the gentleman's smoking a pipe. That you would not see today, but his lathe is in the middle of their living room, and his patient spouse is, of course, cleaning everything up and beautifying it with flowers. And what's also particularly interesting about this is that it is advertising for you to buy the whole series of these. And if we had a whole bunch of them, you'd see that they're all these sort of comical plays on spheres of domesticity of the day, but they're all arguing that these are rare volumes, that you need to preserve them, you need to have them bound, and we will sell you all of these bindings, all of these for just $3.75 a volume, a complete set of everything ever published for just $10. Getting the most out of your lathe, today's funny book. Well, thanks for watching. We'll be back next week and every week for another edition of Buy Day Friday. Well, hello everybody. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. And today I want to tell you about some amazing books I found while on vacation. Now, discerning viewers of Buy Day may realize that last week's show was pre-taped. And that's because I and the family went to upstate New York and Ontario for 2 weeks and had a wonderful time. There was plenty of swimming and plenty of biking and other things, but I always make time to go book shopping. And when we were up in the Finger Lake region, we started at an amazing bookstore I'd never been to before called Old Scrolls. And Old Scrolls was in a couple's home, Ron and Catherine. As long as you call ahead, they'll stay open late, which they did for us. And it's laid out as you might imagine a bookstore in someone's home. So they had wine and cooking in their kitchen, and they had fiction in the guest bedroom. And you know what they had in the main room of the house, in the living room, which is the real specialty? They had decorative cloth bindings. My favorite period of decorative cloth bindings from about 1890 to 1910. And if you've watched this show before, you know that I really love some of the female designers, especially Margaret Armstrong. So I asked Ron and Catherine, do you have any books by Margaret Armstrong? And oh, yes, they did. They had a tremendous number. I'd actually never seen so many books designed by Margaret Armstrong in one place outside of like an exhibit. And it was pretty amazing. So just to give you a sense of what they had, here is Margaret Armstrong in red cloth. There's the monogram there. Remember, during this period, the booksellers are trying to sell the books, so they're using bright colors and beautiful designs, but look at the Art Nouveau flowers that she designed. Here's one of the classic Henry Van Dyke. She did a whole bunch of these Henry Van Dyke books. This one has fruit and flowers, dark blue with gold. Here is one I hadn't seen. This is a beautiful Margaret Armstrong design. There's the monogram down there, also with flowers. And then this one I thought was particularly nice. You have this lovely tree with the heart-shaped roots, also inscribed by Margaret Armstrong. So that was an example of her work during her heyday, during this decorative cloth period, the period in American publishing before dust jackets, and when gilding and Art Nouveau designs were all the rage. But they had one particular book that was more valuable, which I purchased, and this is the one I wanted to tell you about today. And this is a collection of poems by the great American poet Paul Laurence Dunbar. Now, he was the first African-American poet in America to gain widespread fame, and was a great influence on many writers in the 20th century. What I like about this Margaret Armstrong design is that she gets credit not only for the book cover design, but also, and importantly, for the interior design as well. So the decorations, as you can see, are noted by Margaret Armstrong. Now, Armstrong paired with Dunbar for a series of books, and they're also extremely interesting because they are filled with photographs of African Americans. And they are not your stereotypical photographs of the period. If you were to compare this to, say, trade advertising during the Jim Crow period, or even stereo view cards, they tend to be very stereotypical and not flattering of African Americans. Whereas the photographs in Dunbar's books are all really quite nice. They show self-determination, they show strength and pride, and they show courtship between African Americans. And this is particularly different from the standard sort of fare of the period, and I think it's really remarkable and worth commenting on. So these are love poems that Dunbar has written. They're being marketed to a largely white middle class audience, the same audience of Margaret Armstrong, but they're portraying African Americans in a very positive light. Dunbar is the poet who wrote the famous line, I know why the caged bird sings, which Maya Angelou, of course, copied for her autobiography. But these books, and there's several that Margaret Armstrong did the decorations for, are really amazing because of the very positive depictions of African Americans. So that's Little Gal. It's written in dialect, which is a little jarring for the modern ear, but it's a beautiful, beautiful design book, and I was thrilled to find that at Old Scrolls. So before we left Old Scrolls, we asked Ron and Kathy, are there any other bookstores that we have to check out in the Finger Lakes region in upstate New York before we go up to Canada? And they said, well, there is this one gentleman, he's in his 80s now, his bookstore is no longer open to the public, but maybe if you give him a call, he might let you in. And so we got the phone number, and I called the next day in the morning, and I got the gentleman's daughter, and they said, well, he could probably be found at this address. So I went and I tracked him down. I introduced myself as, hi, I'm Eric, I'm a bookseller from Pennsylvania. And he said, well, if you're a bookseller from Pennsylvania, then you're gonna want what I have. I have 62 county histories of Pennsylvania counties in a storage unit not far from here. Are you interested? And of course I said, I am absolutely interested. So I followed him over rolling hill in upstate New York, from the Livonia area up towards Rochester, if you know where this is. He was going quite fast, but I managed to keep up, and we ended up at a public storage unit in the middle of nowhere. Lo and behold, when we opened the door to the public storage unit, there were 12 boxes filled with these wonderful county histories. Now, I can't show those to you today because my car was packed with bicycles and other things for vacation, not to mention family and children at this point, but I was able to leave the books with my uncle, and they'll be coming down to the Scholar when he next visits, which is going to be sometime in about a month. I did, however, take a couple other Pennsylvania books that were part of this larger county collection. There's some general Pennsylvania books, and I have one which I can show you, which is absolutely fascinating. One of the most interesting stories that I've heard recently, and that is this interesting book called A View of Pennsylvania. Now, you look at the binding and you see that this is clearly an early Republic binding. It's actually from 1811 or 1812. And if you look at the title page, you'll see that this is a work by Benjamin Franklin that was published in Philadelphia in 1812. Now, that in of itself is interesting. Franklin has been dead for 20 years at this point, but he's being given credit for this book. But when you start to look at the book beyond the title page, look at the font. Here, Amanda, zoom in. There's the font for the title page. But when you look at the rest of the book, the paper is very different, the font is very different. And immediately you realize that this is an 18th century book with a 19th century title page. And doing more research, I found out that Benjamin Franklin had this book published in 1769 when he was in London as the colonial agent. And it was an attack on the Penn family, specifically the fact that the Penn family wasn't paying taxes on their land. Now, we understand this in Harrisburg because we have the state capital, and the capital is tax exempt, so it means we have to pay more taxes, those of us who live here. But Franklin wrote this, or had written this work and published in 1769. It was mainly geared towards a English audience, but he did send some copies back to Pennsylvania. They weren't bound at the time, and they sat. They actually sat for 20 plus years until this bookseller here, who was Olmsted and Power, found the original printed copies from the 1760s and reissued them, with giving Franklin credit as the author for the first time in 1812. So it's an original Franklin imprint, published or republished in 1812 using the original things in an early Republic binding, which is really a fascinating story. One other note about this book, it is not only a Franklin printed book, but it has the famous quote, which is often misquoted, which is, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." That is the famous Franklin quote, which actually comes from this 1769 work, republished here in 1812. Pretty awesome. All right. Let's end with a funny book on the way up. It was a road trip, and we stopped by the Lewisburg Freeze, our favorite place for ice cream on 15, and it's right near Mondragon. Now, Mondragon's a wonderful bookstore. We're friends with the owners there, and they gave me a very good book for my road trip. It was called Flattened Fauna, a field guide to common animal that you might find on the roads. And Flattened Fauna is basically a series of black diagrams of what animals look like when they are flattened. This would be a Norway rat. Looks a bit like Norway, doesn't it, Amanda? And this one here, probably familiar to many of our walkers in Riverfront Park, that would be the common woodchuck, upside down. Now, it's even more morbid than that because it encourages you to keep a death list in the back where you can write all the... I did not do that on our trip, but I want to thank our friends at Mondragon for a funny book. And next week, I'll tell you about our time in Canada and at the bookstores in Toronto. So please consider liking our YouTube page. You can click subscribe by clicking the bell on YouTube, and that will give you access to all these buy days, plus many author talks. We'll see you next week on Buy Day Friday. Hey everybody, it's Friday, so it must be a buy day. I'm Eric Papenfuse, coming from you live here at the Midtown Scholar Sort Room. And as promised, I want to take you on the second half of my family's summer vacation today. First half in upstate New York. We saw some of the finds last week. Well, this week we're going to look at some of the finds we found in Ontario, Canada. Let's get right to it. Now, as I'm getting these books out, let me tell you the best way to watch these videos is by going over to YouTube and liking and subscribing to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore channel there. We've got over 1,000 subscribers. If you subscribe, it'll send you alerts whenever these new buy days come on Fridays. And today is our 20th episode, so you can see all 20 of them archived over on YouTube. Well, we went up in Ontario, Canada to a place called Kirchner, which is next to a smaller town called Waterloo. And we stopped there to look at some of the local bookstores, and we went book browsing, and we found an old grist mill. And by this grist mill in Waterloo, Canada, there was a historic marker, and it explained that the town of Kirchner had originally been called Berlin. And during World War I, they understandably had to change the name to something a little bit more patriotic. But the entire town and the entire area was founded, according to the historic marker, by Mennonite farmers from central Pennsylvania, right here in Cumberland and Lancaster County. I had no idea. And the story goes that a company called the German Company bought 60,000 acres of land right there in Ontario from the heirs of Joseph Brant, who was the great Mohawk leader who sided with the British during the American Revolution and was given these lands to sell as in part compensation. Well, they apparently paid $10,000, and they took the $10,000 in silver coins hidden in drums, in barrels, in a by-Conestoga wagon right here from Harrisburg and Lancaster all the way up to pay for the land there in Ontario. A fascinating story. Now, they were farmers, and they cleared the land, and they established the grist mill, and they needed ways to basically store wheat and grind wheat into bread. And it was amazing because at the next bookstore we visited, we came across an amazing old book here, which I will show you, which was about that very topic. It was about the conservation of grains and how to protect your grains. It was written by a very famous French scientist who, during the 18th century, developed all sorts of ways for preventing crops from spoiling. And let me show you some of the amazing plates in this old book. All of them were about sort of drying the grain and heating the grain. If you look at this plate, you'll see the bellows and the modern storage system to kill parasites and to help the grain be preserved. Now, this is exactly the type of book that may have come by Conestoga Wagon. And in the front of the book, there was a little note that says, Dear Harvey, from 1928, this book was brought by my ancestors to the area. So did it come from central Pennsylvania? We may never know. It did come to us from a little bookstore called Balfour Books in Toronto, which was our next stop. And Balfour was a great academic bookstore. It's been there for a long time in Toronto. And I used my trick, Amanda, which was there were these books that looked like they needed repair behind the counter. I said, hey, what is that book with the ruined spine? Can I see it? And they said, well, we don't really know what to do with it. It's poor condition. And that's how I came up with this great book on ancient grains. Well, while we were in Toronto, we also went to a very high-end bookstore. It was an amazing store because it had bookcase after bookcase after bookcase of books on Canadian history. First bookstore I've ever been to, which had no American history, all Canadian history, and rightly so. But amidst the bookcases, we found this amazing book, which was called A Tour of Hartford and Quebec, and it was a book that was written by the Yale professor Benjamin Silliman in 1820. This is the New Haven published copy about his travels up to Canada. And here's a fun fact. When I was in graduate school and met my wife, she was teaching British history for a professor named Linda Colley. And they were doing a chapter on American views of England in the early 19th century. And Benjamin Silliman also wrote a book about his travels in England. And I got to impersonate him for the class. And that was one of the first things that we did together. So I've always had a soft spot for Benjamin Silliman. He discovered meteors and dinosaurs, and he was the first professor at Yale to allow women to attend his classes. And he did this very early in the 19th century, long before Yale was coeducational. So good for him. And what's interesting is this book has actual female ownership. It was owned by Elizabeth Calverley. Don't know who that is, but maybe Elizabeth audited one of Benjamin Silliman's classes, and maybe she didn't. I was reading this book up in Canada, and I was looking at the index, and would you believe it, but there was a very important chapter on caution to strangers in Canada. So I figured I'd better read that while I was up there. And I read the caution to strangers in Canada, and it basically says, soon after arriving, almost every stranger finds his stomach and bowels deranged. And that was the term Silliman used for an upset stomach. And according to him, it had to do with the diet in Canada. Don't trust the food. They didn't drink enough tea, they ate late in the night, and they ate too much junk food. And so you might get derangement of the stomach. And I have to say, this thought occurred to me that perhaps I should share with you my favorite Canadian junk food, which is ketchup chips. Amanda, have you ever had ketchup chips?
I have not.
It's a distinctly Canadian snack food. Basically, Canadians love their ketchup, and unlike American ketchup, it's highly vinegary ketchup, so it tastes nothing. You get Heinz ketchup in Canada, it's a totally different recipe than ketchup in America. So I must confess, I probably ate too many of these late at night, and I should have heeded Benjamin Silliman's warning. We're going to share those ketchup chips with the rest of the staff. All right, we're going to end with a funny book today, and I want to again thank our friends at Mondragon Books. They gave me this on my way up to Canada when we stopped by Lewisburg, just like last week, but this week's book was even better. It's Mime Time. And yes, this is a book which teaches you 45 complete routines for everyone. Now, you can either mime by yourself or you can mime in groups. And one of the things I particularly like about this book is that it has perhaps the most Canadian mime routine you could possibly want, the hockey goon. All right, imagine a scene, Amanda. Here we are. Scene. In revenge, Wally skates behind another opponent and trips him, clobbers him with a stick, and then jumps up on him, up and down, smashing the poor guy to a pulp. A ref blows the whistle, and Wally stops. Who, me? He says. I wasn't doing anything. the hockey goom mind routine. Can you get anything more Canadian than that? So that was our Canadian trip. We will be back next week with another edition of Buy Day every Friday at noon. Thanks for watching and subscribe to us on YouTube, Midtown Scholar Bookstore.